Music is just so beautiful, making us connect to spirit, isn't it? Yes. Thank you, guys. That was great. So my last Sunday, we were in the prayer room before service, and Reverend Bobby was leading the prayer, and she said something about Reverend John and the talk that he's planned versus the talk that he's going to give. Versus the talk that you're going to hear. And I'm not sure exactly what that's going to look like right now. You know, it's surprisingly so emotional for me, but not surprising. And the things that sneak up on you and surprise you, besides the hugs and the well wishes, as I'm sitting there and we brought up the mission statement of the exploration team, I almost lost it. Because this was created and driven by the exploration teams, and it's such a powerful vision that has set us on a course that is, you know, it's uncharted, but behind it is the trust in spirit, which has really been remarkable through this whole process. So, you know, it's my last Sunday, and there are really no words that can describe how I feel about this connection except to say it's been a momentous moment. Momentous moment in my life. And I'm honored by the opportunity to have that with you all. So that brings up another momentous moment in my life as minister, and that is 30 years ago, Dr. Kennedy Schultz, who was president of Religious Science International at the time, officiated the wedding vows between me and Reverend Kath. She is, thank you. And it's connected to ministry because of him. He was a father figure to Reverend Kath and a good friend of mine. And he guided us through some very difficult times. So that was 30 years ago in Atlanta, Georgia. The plan is she's today in Prescott, Arizona, doing her work as interim minister. And so we're going to have a rendezvous in baggage claim tomorrow in Seattle. Now, I know that's not very romantic. We had our 30th celebration in going to Egypt in the last November. So that was that event. So I wanted to look at, you know, from that time 30 years ago to landing here in Seal Beach, and because there's so many stories of ministry in between that, you know, are, at least to me, very entertaining and momentous moments. But I decided to pick one. And I think one of the most significant ones was my ordination ceremony. And so in religious science at that time, in the culture, there was a meme going on that said, if you were accused of being a religious scientist, would there be enough evidence to convict you? And so it's a really weird question. And I've got a really weird sense of humor, but we decided to actually rent a space that was in the Historical Society of Orlando, and it was in the building that was the Orlando Orange County Courthouse. And so we rented that space, and it had a big jury box that was tilted toward the judge's bench, and an elevated judge's bench, and a defendant's table, and a prosecutor's table. And so we had Reverend Dr. Bob Dean. If you don't know him, he was in the education department at Home Office. So he was officiating it, or the judge for the trial. And I have to reveal, this was my criminal past. And so we had practitioners and ministers from the area that were in the jury box, and we went through a whole trial process. Now, I'm sitting at the defendant's table, And we only had 8 people in the jury box because there was also a hurricane that was coming up the coast. And we didn't know whether we were going to have it or not. So one of the questions they asked, the prosecutor asked, were you ever in doubt that you would hold this event tonight? And as a good, arrogant religious scientist, I said no. And so that was part of one of the questions that led to my conviction. But I'm sitting at the defendant's table, and I see in the corner there's a piece of plexiglass on the table. And I went over to look at it, and carved into there was the name Ted Bundy. If you don't know who that was, he was a serial killer. So I was actually convicted in the same courtroom as Ted Bundy. So there was a lot of strangeness about that night of a hurricane coming and, Ted Bundy and being convicted of being a religious scientist. And the question is, what is a religious scientist anyway? Does anyone still use that term? Do you identify as a religious scientist? And maybe you do, maybe you don't, but it's really changed over the years. And the question of, is there enough evidence to convict you, is a really strange question, because it comes, at least in my mind, from a place of extreme defensiveness. We had to defend ourselves in the culture that we had a right to be there as religious scientists. Is that making sense? And I don't know if anybody's ever felt anything like that. But it became something that over the years I constantly revisited. Is, would I be convicted today of being a religious scientist? But we had a good time. We had heavy hors d'oeuvres and classical music, and it was just a great time. At the end of the service, though, we had something that was very special to me. We had a circle of ministers and practitioners, and these were both from RSI and United. And for me, it was a very healing circle, because at that time, United and RSI did not really get along very well. This was pre-merger, pre-unification. And so there was some contention within this community, and had been for years. And I've got a bunch of stories about that, but I'm not going to get into that. So, it just raises for me this issue of, was there this question of spiritual arrogance in the culture of New Thought? And I think there was. I think there was spiritual arrogance, spiritual indifference, and spiritual ignorance. It's not part of the philosophy, but in terms of the structure of the organization, it seemed very apparent to me. And I'm not just speaking of this because I think it's so. I've experienced it in so many different interactions with the leadership in both organizations. And the question is, well, how do you know? Well, an example is in all the conferences that I went to at Asilomar or other conferences, one of the first questions that you would be asked as a minister is, how big is your community? How many people do you have? How many practitioners do you have? Do you own your own building? And depending on who was asking it and whatever measure that they had of your ability to fit in or be recognized, the answer was always, what's in your consciousness? What's in your consciousness that you don't measure up? And, I had to ask, am I complicit in any of that at all? And I remember in classes sometimes people would come in and the students would even challenge each other. Somebody would come in with a cold or a broken arm, and somebody would blurt out, what were you thinking? What was in your consciousness? And it was really heartbreaking. And in counseling sessions, people would come in just burdened with this metaphysical guilt about not measuring up. Not measuring up. And it was, this isn't what we see in the philosophy necessarily, so where did it all come from? And I think there are some systemic issues that really brought it out. And I don't know exactly what it is, but I think it's not just new thought. I think it's more widespread as a general dysfunction in our culture. Is, you know, you look at primitive Christianity. When we look at what Christ actually did and taught, he was always working with the disenfranchised, with the poor, the weak, you know, the people on the edges of society. And in fact, Paul formed small groups of people like that, where they could share their experience with the message of redemption or salvation or whatever it was, but realizing that within them was something that was legitimate. And these small groups were safe places. And Christianity caught on fire because of those small groups, up until about the 3rd century, where it became institutionalized. And a lot of those teachings of Christ were lost, or at least minimized. And so you look at Christianity today, at least popular Christianity, and you've got to scratch your head and say, this is not what Christ was about. So I think there's a larger dysfunction here about, and maybe it's just the Western culture, but I don't think so. Because I can look at, you know, not only was I measuring myself against some imaginary definition of what religious science was, but challenging my competency as a minister, as a husband, as a father, as a parent, as a lover, all of those things, you know, was I a good provider? And it was always bringing into the question of, was I enough? Was I enough? And I think that's the biggest cultural issue facing us today, is this sense of not enoughness. We all live in this environment of having an expectation of what life should be. And so we try and control and manage everything and be anything but vulnerable. I've seen it in corporations where, you know, the CEO cannot show any sign of weakness or doubt, because that would impact the community or the culture. And yet everybody in the culture was feeling the same thing of not being good enough. And the thing that was never talked about was the idea that Pam was so eloquently talking about, is this hardness of head and this heaviness of heart that has to be concealed rather than revealed. And so I think that's something that we really need to take a harder look at. So I want to stop here and tell a story. And you may have heard it before. It's called The Story of the Cracked Pot. A water bearer in India had 2 large pots, each hung on a pole, which he carried across his neck. One of the pots had a crack in it, and while the other pot was perfect and always delivered a full portion of water, at the end of the long walk from the stream to the master's house, the cracked pot arrived only half full. For 2 full years, this went on daily, with the bearer delivering only 1.5 pots full of water in his master's house. Of course, the perfect pot was proud of its accomplishments. I didn't know pots could feel that way, but apparently perfect to the end for which it was made. But the poor cracked pot was ashamed of its own imperfection and miserable that it was able to accomplish only half of what it has been made to do. After 2 years of what it perceived to be a bitter failure, it spoke to the water bearer one day by the stream. "I'm ashamed of myself, and I want to apologize to you." The bearer asked, "Why? What are you ashamed of?" The pot replied, "For these past 2 years, I am able to deliver only half of my load because this crack in my side causes the water to leak out all the way back to the master's house. Because of my flaws, you don't get full value for your efforts." The water bearer felt sorry for the old cracked pot, And in his compassion, he said, as we return to the master's house, I want you to notice the beautiful flowers along the path. As they went up the hill, the old crackpot took notice of the sun warming the beautiful wildflowers on the side of the path, and this cheered it somewhat. But at the end of the trail, it still felt bad because it had leaked out half its load, and so again it apologized to the bearer for its failure. The bearer said to the pot, did you notice that there were flowers only on your side of the path, but not on the other pot's side? That's because I have always known about your flaw, and I took advantage of it. I planted flower seeds on your side of the path, and every day while we walked back from the stream, you've watered them. For 2 years, I have been able to pick these beautiful flowers to grace my master's table. Without you being just the way you are, he would not have this beauty to grace his house. In Japan, I think they have a practice called kintsugi, where they take a broken pot and they put it back together with gold. And it's a process of forgiveness and celebrating the flaws that we all have. Interesting. So I brought my 30 years of consulting experience and 20 years of ministry, and equipped with a lot of tools and ideas and training, and landed here in Seal Beach with a bunch of crackpots. And although I knew what CSL was looking for, home office, what they wanted, and had lots of ideas about what should happen, I surrendered and simply presenced what was present. I witnessed 3 brave women keeping it together, and a small group of folks committed to each other with a willingness to do whatever it takes to keep it together. It was, for me, a major Momo. So we started to meet with, we didn't call it a care group when we started. We just sat down together and talked. And I said, let's start with prayer, and then let's start with recognizing something good in our lives. And that was easy to do. Everybody could do that. And then we also added that piece that Pam talked about is there any heaviness in your heart? Or is there something that's just bothering you mentally that is preventing us from meeting on a clean slate? And so that began the process of opening our hearts first to whatever was on the agenda. Because the context of how we meet is so much more important than anything on the agenda, than any of the content that we have to talk about. Until we can clear the air between us and open our hearts, we can't have an honest conversation about what is really happening. And so we shared all of this together. We met on Sundays, we had the workshops where we talked about what we were, the past of this community, what we were proud about, and the things that were more of a challenge, the things that we were sorry that happened, the anger, the grief, the disappointment, all of that stuff. And I think we got a lot of it out. We cleared the air quite a bit by getting that out. Kierkegaard said, life can only be understood backwards, but it has to be lived forward. Very interesting. We have to be able to look at the past and come to peace with it. So I think folks started to feel a little bit safer and more hopeful, which allowed us to begin to discuss some harder realities, like, is there any way that we could fund a minister full-time? And the answer came back, no, especially not after the pandemic. I mean, the community was smaller, and the donations weren't there, and there was just, I think when I came, we were still questioning whether we could even have a service in person. Yeah, that was a long time ago. But because we had opened our hearts up, we were able to look at that and discover that there were more possibilities out there, and we could recognize that there was this power welling up within us to look at things differently. Brene Brown says this: Vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. And that's what we discovered in the small groups. So once we set aside the option of candidating, we opened the possibility of collaboration, which was really exciting, and we did a lot there. At the same time, I visited our sister church, Namaste, and I watched this minister presence the vulnerability of another post-pandemic community. I marveled at the skill that she led this community with extraordinary respect and compassion. And I saw her loving kindness as she expressed toward another bunch of beautiful crackpots. Now, whether through experience or natural talent, I saw in Reverend Bobby an extraordinary woman whose skills in leveraging the power and possibilities of being vulnerable far surpassed my own skill. I knew I found a cooperative component in creating something extraordinary. She's the real deal, and I'm proud to call her a dear friend. Let's hear it. So I don't necessarily sleep well at night because I have a lot of ideas and a lot of excitement about this community and what we're moving toward. And I really appreciate Bobby's willingness to hear me out and trust her to keep me grounded in this process of letting this community find its own future rather than being driven by anything that either one of us says. And that's different. You can't begin to understand how different that is for a community to take charge on its own to step into that brilliant future. And so I keep asking myself the religious science question and see how religious science has evolved over the years to a deeper place in consciousness. Because the limit of imagination is set by what we fear. And so our job is to root out the ways that we habitually deceive ourselves about what's possible. Because then imagination can spring open. So the most important way of evolving to the next level of consciousness is to go deeper, to begin to understand more about vulnerability and developing the core competencies, among other things, of being able to have difficult to have conversations and to be at ease with uncertainty. Because discomfort is the gateway to evolution. And we're at a point in the evolution of our centers that has to happen if CSL, if science of mind, if religious science is going to flourish again. What we're doing has been rarely done, probably never done in New Thought. But it is a natural outpicturing of all the prayers, all the treatment about creating a world that works for all. Doesn't that make sense? Even if we're uncomfortable with how it looks, we have to step into that place of trusting that prayer works. Isn't that what we're about? And so if this is the natural unfolding of the process that we're involved in for a year and a half, then it must be the right thing to do. I don't know how else to look at it. It's the natural consequence of the emerging soul needs of this community and all the communities out there. In practice, religious science has evolved now to where it's driven more from the heart rather than the head. We've looked at over the years different modalities of creative self-expression and the creative process in the individual with Wayne Dyer, Deepak Chopra, Eckhart Tolle, Abraham Hicks, Brené Brown. I mean, the list goes on and on of all the things that we're drawing from because we're trying to address this issue of not enoughness, of recognizing that everything that we need is present in this room right here and right now. We don't need to draw from anywhere else. Our good is not outside of ourselves, it's right here. So what's emerging is this new model moving from minister-centric to mission-centric. Okay, Reverend John, what the heck does that mean? Okay. The minister's job is to take responsibility for everything. The minister's job is to predict and control, and with the help of the board and volunteers, manage the never enough resources and try to create more programs, fundraisers, and special events to mitigate the not enoughness. That's the minister-centric model. How's it worked? So there's got to be a different way. And I think, when we talk about not enough, we're not just talking about money here. The next step in new thought is healing this consciousness of not enoughness. Not enough resources, not enough health, not enough peace, prosperity, not enough love. As long as we're in that place, we're going to demonstrate more of what we're experiencing. Right? Because the universe doesn't listen to words, it listens to what's in our heart and can only demonstrate what is in our heart. And so if we're constantly coming from that place of, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I don't have enough money, I'm not a good enough religious scientist, then we're always going to experience lack. And so there's a fundamental shift here of becoming mission-centric. The mission-centric model focuses on beingness of all the people in the community, the fulfillment of purpose in each individual and the entire community. Who you are and what your experience is critically important to me, but I'm only one person. Who you are and what you're experiencing is important to Reverend Bobby, but she's one person. And we cannot carry that burden of helping everyone in the community fulfill their purpose. So it's got to be generated from somewhere else. And where it's got to be generated in is from each person here. Each person in the community has to take a role in their willingness to be vulnerable and the willingness to embrace the vulnerability in another person. Because that vulnerability in the other person is a mirror of what's going on in our life and our critical pieces to fill in what's missing in our own hearts. That's why this is so important. Because when we do that, we become integrated, we become whole, and we're able to demonstrate more powerfully using the science of mind principles. So imagine a community that rather than donating for what it gets, this is called the receivership model, which is the old model, rather than donating for what it gets, a great music program, a nifty talk by a speaker, wonderful classes, all of that stuff that we pay for because that's what we're receiving. Instead of doing that, we're investing in a community as if it's the most important component in our retirement fund. It's a very different way of looking at things. Because we know what we invest in our retirement fund is going to carry us through for the rest of our life to live more richly, to live happier. And that's the difference of the community investing in purpose. Is that making sense? Imagine a community able to regenerate and sustain itself despite a pandemic, despite a recession, and despite the minister changing. The community can do that on its own because it's not dependent on what's outside of it. Imagine a community eagerly embracing spiritual evolution as its natural mission. We can't wait to grow and change and evolve. I know that can be really hard. I remember Oprah saying, one year I asked to be strong. And she said, I got more challenges that year than I ever did in my life, and I'll never ask for that again. But she also claimed she was fundamentally changed by it forever, and it made her stronger. You know, we have to have that willingness to do that. Imagine a community where the sacred is recognized and celebrated in each person, all living things, this planet, and seeing the sacred as the essence of the entire universe. That demands a change in consciousness. We don't just look at that thing outside of us, we see the sacred in it. So what is it going to take to do this? Well, it's going to take everyone stepping up to a level that they can, to embrace and envelop each other, to listen deeply to each other's experience, because it is in the sharing is the answer to every question and the solution to every problem, to quote Ernest Holmes. Each of us must go deeper in loving kindness than we thought possible, and courageously risk vulnerability and learn those competencies of having difficult to have conversations. It's very emotional, and it's hard for me to leave at this exciting point in our new venture, when the wildflower seeds are just being planted and watered by the exploration teams. And I can't wait to come back and see it in full bloom. But I do know what the future of religious science is, because I'm looking at it right now. And it's beautiful. So it is.